What would drive a man of God to commit one of the most gruesome crimes California has ever seen? The answer lies in a DNA test, a test that shattered lives, exposed unspeakable betrayal, and led a respected preacher to kill his wife in a fit of rage. It all came crashing down one Sunday morning. Pastor Benjamin Marshall stood before his congregation, delivering a sermon with his usual passion. The words flowed from his lips, but they would be his last as a free man. The church doors flew open, slamming against the walls. Uniformed officers stormed inside, their voices sharp and commanding. "Pastor Benjamin Marshall, you're under arrest." The preacher froze. The congregation erupted in gasps and whispers as officers marched up the aisle. His Bible slipped from his trembling hands, landing on the ground with a thud. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists. The metallic sound echoed through the sanctuary, silencing the whispers. Mothers shielded their children's eyes. Longtime parishioners shook their heads in disbelief. This wasn't just the fall of a preacher. This was the beginning of a horrifying revelation, a story of murder, dismemberment, and betrayal. And it all started with one devastating truth: the 4 children he'd raised as his own weren't his. Before we dive into this heartbreaking case, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Crimeberry Stories. This story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about trust and loyalty. Nestled in the heart of a small California town, the Star Miracle Church was more than just a place of worship. It was a cornerstone of the community. Its modest steeple, whitewashed walls, and rows of handmade pews stood as a testament to faith and perseverance. It was a church Pastor Benjamin Marshall had built from nothing, brick by brick, with the unwavering support of his congregation. The people who filled those pews every Sunday were hardworking and devout, a tight-knit group who saw Benjamin not just as their preacher but as their guiding light. He was their counselor, their mentor, their rock in times of trouble. And he embraced the role wholeheartedly, weaving scripture into every corner of their lives. Benjamin's rise to prominence as a preacher had been nothing short of remarkable. Raised by a strict father, he had learned discipline and resilience early in life. Though their relationship had always been strained, marked by an unspoken competition for approval, it shaped Benjamin into the man he became, a leader who demanded respect yet exuded warmth. His family mirrored the image of perfection. His wife, Evelyn Marshall, was the epitome of grace and devotion. Whether she was leading the church choir, organizing charity drives, or preparing Sunday meals, she carried herself with an air of quiet strength. Her love for Benjamin seemed unwavering, as did her dedication to their 4 children. The children, the pride of their father, were often described as the perfect blend of charm and humility. Benjamin spoke of them often during sermons, weaving stories of their achievements into his lessons on faith and family. To outsiders, the Marshalls were an unshakable pillar of unity. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. There were moments when Evelyn seemed distant, her eyes lingering a little too long on nothing in particular. Subtle tensions between Benjamin and his father, Walter Marshall, flared during family gatherings, though they were quickly masked with forced smiles. And Benjamin himself, while adored by his congregation, seemed to carry an unspoken burden, a shadow that clung to his every move. The stage was set for tragedy, though no one could have predicted just how dark the story would become. It started as a light-hearted moment, a congregation member presenting Pastor Benjamin Marshall with a small, neatly wrapped box during his birthday celebration. "Just for fun," the woman laughed, holding out the DNA test kit. The room joined her in laughter, and Benjamin chuckled along, brushing it off as a harmless gesture. The kit sat unopened on his desk for weeks, collecting dust. But one evening, with the house quiet and his curiosity nagging, Benjamin decided to give it a try. On a whim, he thought, why not test the children too? It wasn't suspicion, just idle curiosity, an idea that seemed amusing at the time. Weeks later, the results arrived. He sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the report with an air of indifference. But as his eyes scanned the pages, his demeanor shifted. Confusion. Disbelief. A chill creeping down his spine. For words blared in his mind, louder with each passing second. Not a match. His hands began to tremble as he reread the results, hoping he had made a mistake. But the numbers didn't change. The report was clear: none of his children were biologically his. His heart pounded in his chest, anger bubbling beneath the surface. His breathing quickened. His mind raced. Evelyn. The name felt foreign now. The woman he had trusted, loved, built a life with. She had lied to him. When she walked into the room that night, he confronted her. His voice was calm at first, almost eerily so, as he slid the papers across the table. "What is this?" he asked. Her eyes darted to the report. For a moment, she froze, her face a mask of shock. Then came the denials. "This has to be a mistake," she stammered. "It's not possible, Benjamin. You know it's not possible." But his eyes bore into hers, unrelenting. "Tell me the truth." Her facade began to crumble. Tears welled up in her eyes as she begged him to believe her. But the weight of his glare, the sheer force of his presence, pressed her into a corner she couldn't escape. And then the dam broke. Through sobs, she confessed. An affair. Years ago. With his father. A betrayal so profound it sucked the air from the room. Benjamin stood frozen, his mind shattering under the weight of her words. His father. His own blood. He didn't yell. He didn't scream. He simply walked away. But something inside him shifted that night. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Humiliation, betrayal, rage. He avoided Evelyn, barely speaking to her except in cold, clipped sentences. At church, he stumbled through sermons, his once commanding voice faltering. His congregation noticed his growing distance, his erratic behavior. Whispers began to spread, though no one dared to confront him. At night, he sat alone, consumed by thoughts he could no longer control. Memories of his father's disapproving stares mixed with Evelyn's tearful confession. A toxic blend of anger and despair twisted in his gut, suffocating him. He tried to pray, but the words felt hollow. His faith, once a source of strength, now seemed like a cruel joke. And through it all, one thought began to take root, dark and unrelenting. Someone has to pay for this. It was late. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, her head bowed, her hands clasped tightly together as if in silent prayer. Benjamin stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the room. He had been watching her for minutes, the storm inside him building with each passing second. "Do you even feel remorse?" His voice, low and sharp, cut through the silence like a blade. Evelyn looked up, her face pale and exhausted. "Benjamin, I've told you everything. I don't know what else you want me to say. I want you to tell me how you could do this to me," he snapped, stepping closer. "To us. To our family." Tears welled in her eyes, but Benjamin didn't care. Her sorrow only fueled his anger. He slammed his fist on the table, making her flinch. "You ruined my life," he shouted, his voice cracking. "My reputation, my ministry, my children, all of it. Was it worth it? Answer me." Evelyn tried to stand, her hands trembling as she reached out toward him. "Benjamin, please. I made a mistake, but we can move past this. We can." "Don't you dare," he interrupted, his voice trembling with rage. "Don't you dare pretend this can be fixed." The argument escalated, their voices rising until they were practically screaming at each other. Years of resentment, betrayal, and pain spilled out in a torrent of accusations and denials. Then, in a moment of blind fury, Benjamin snapped. His hands closed around her throat, and before he even realized what he was doing, he was squeezing. Evelyn's eyes widened in shock as she struggled against him, her nails clawing at his arms. But he didn't stop. The room seemed to blur around him. All he could hear was the sound of his own ragged breathing and Evelyn's gasps for air. His grip tightened until, finally, her body went limp. For a moment, there was only silence. Benjamin stepped back, staring down at her lifeless form. His chest heaved as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. "Oh God," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" Panic set in almost immediately. He paced the room, his mind racing for a solution. He couldn't call the police. He couldn't let anyone find out. His reputation, his career, his life, it would all be over. That's when the idea came to him. A dark, terrible idea that made his stomach turn. But he couldn't see another way out. He moved mechanically, grabbing tools from the garage, a hacksaw, garbage bags, cleaning supplies. His hands shook as he worked, but he forced himself to keep going. Every cut, every movement felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Blood pooled on the floor, staining the tiles. The metallic smell filled the air, making him gag. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Piece by piece, he dismembered her body, wrapping each part in plastic and sealing it tightly. When the gruesome task was finally done, he stood there for a moment, staring at the black bags that now contained the woman he had once loved. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. He loaded the bags into his car under the cover of darkness, driving to different locations across the county. A wooded area. A lake. An abandoned lot. Each stop felt like an eternity, his heart pounding with every glance in the rearview mirror. When he finally returned home, the house was eerily quiet. He scrubbed the floors until his hands were raw, erasing every trace of what had happened. But no amount of cleaning could erase the image of Evelyn's lifeless eyes from his mind. As dawn approached, he collapsed onto the couch, staring blankly at the ceiling. He had done what he thought was necessary. But deep down, he knew the truth. There was no escaping what he had done. It didn't take long for people to notice Evelyn was missing. At first, the members of the congregation assumed she had simply gone away for a visit. She had family in nearby towns, after all. But when weeks passed without a word, the whispers started. Benjamin's excuses grew more strained. "She's not feeling well," he'd say, his voice tight. But the congregation wasn't convinced. Evelyn, the ever-vibrant woman who always made sure to lend a hand at every church event, was nowhere to be seen. Some of the church members took it upon themselves to ask Benjamin directly. The answers were never clear, and the more they probed, the more Benjamin's demeanor seemed to shift. His eyes would dart nervously, and his smiles became more forced. Still, no one questioned him outright. He was their preacher, their leader. But the absence of Evelyn, coupled with Benjamin's increasingly odd behavior, caught the attention of local law enforcement. A missing person report was filed, and the investigation was officially underway. Neighbors were interviewed, and while most had little to offer, a few had noticed strange things in the past few days. One woman mentioned hearing what she described as loud, angry voices coming from the Marshall home late one night, too loud for a quiet household. Another neighbor reported seeing Benjamin's car leave at odd hours, driving in the direction of remote areas on the outskirts of town. These seemingly innocent observations began to paint a picture. The police dug deeper, and what they found next would send a shock through the entire community. Forensic experts were called in to analyze the Marshall home. A search of the garage revealed bloodstains, carefully scrubbed but not completely erased. The pattern was unmistakable. A struggle had taken place in that very spot. And then, there was the security footage. Surveillance cameras in several locations, previously overlooked, now came into focus. The footage revealed Benjamin's car pulling up to isolated areas late at night. He could be seen unloading large, suspicious-looking bags from his trunk, bags that were later disposed of in the woods, near an abandoned lot, and at a lake. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place, but they still lacked the final piece, the confrontation. And then, they brought Benjamin in for questioning. At first, he was calm, almost too calm. He denied everything. His answers were rehearsed, practiced. "Evelyn is with family," he said again. "She's fine. There's no need for concern." But as the evidence piled up, his story began to unravel. The bloodstains in the garage. The bags found in remote locations. The strange behavior. The neighbors who had seen him leave late at night. The pressure mounted. Benjamin's composure cracked, and for the first time, he began to show signs of the man behind the preacher's mask. His eyes darted nervously. His hands clenched. His voice wavered. "It's all a misunderstanding," he said. "I didn't do anything." But the walls were closing in. With each piece of evidence, the web he had carefully constructed began to collapse. And the truth, as ugly and horrifying as it was, could no longer be denied. Benjamin sat there, his back against the cold metal chair, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. The silence in the interrogation room felt suffocating. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breathing was shallow. 4 hours, he had denied everything. He had clung to the lie that Evelyn had simply disappeared, that nothing was amiss. But the weight of the evidence, his own blood-stained hands, had grown too heavy to bear. Finally, with a shaky exhale, he cracked. I did it, he whispered, almost too quietly for the officers to hear. But they were listening, every ear tuned to his voice. His words hung in the air like a death sentence. The confession poured out of him in a rush. How he had killed Evelyn, how the rage had consumed him, how he had dismembered her body to hide the truth. But there was more. Benjamin's voice wavered as he spoke of the DNA test results that had shattered his world. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with suppressed fury. I found out. The kids aren't mine, he said, his voice thick with anger. My father. He's their father. He betrayed me. He ruined everything. And she kept it from me. She lied. The officers exchanged glances, the shock evident on their faces. But Benjamin's mind was no longer there. He was lost in the whirlwind of emotions, rage, guilt, humiliation. He stood up suddenly, his face contorted in a twisted mix of anger and sorrow. You don't understand. She destroyed me. I had to do it. His voice broke, as if he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. But there was no justification for what he had done. His confession was the beginning of the end. The story would go public, and the media would descend on California like a storm. The courtroom became a theater of emotions, a spectacle no one could have predicted. People from every corner of the state gathered to witness the trial of Benjamin Marshall, the beloved preacher turned murderer. His congregation, once loyal and trusting, now found themselves torn. Many took the stand, some speaking of his kindness, his compassion, and the man they had looked up to. But there were others who saw only the monster he had become. His family members, too, had to face the horror of what Benjamin had done. The defense attorney, a seasoned professional, argued temporary insanity, citing the emotional trauma caused by the revelation of the affair between Benjamin's wife and father. They painted him as a man pushed beyond his limits, his mind consumed by a web of betrayal and loss. But the prosecution was relentless. They pointed to the premeditated nature of the crime, the methodical dismemberment of Evelyn's body, the deliberate attempts to cover up the murder. They painted Benjamin not as a man undone by grief, but as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of the woman he had sworn to love. The jury deliberated for hours, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. When the verdict was finally read, it was met with a mixture of gasps and stunned silence. Benjamin Marshall, once a pillar of his community, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was led away in handcuffs, his face blank, his eyes hollow. But there was no joy in the courtroom. There was no sense of justice served. Only the quiet devastation of a life destroyed, his, Evelyn's, and the lives of those he had left behind. The story of Benjamin Marshall would be remembered not for his sermons or his faith, but for the monstrous crime he had committed, the shattered family he had left in his wake, and the twisted legacy of betrayal that had led him to murder. And as the doors to the courtroom closed behind him, the state of California was left to grapple with the horror of what had unfolded in the small town of Marshall's Crossing. The aftermath of Benjamin Marshall's crime was a shockwave that rippled through the small town, leaving devastation in its wake. It wasn't just a man who had fallen from grace, it was the crumbling of an entire community's foundation. The congregation, once tightly knit and fiercely loyal, now found themselves torn between disbelief and betrayal. For years, Benjamin had been their rock, their moral compass, the man who had guided them through their darkest moments. To hear that he was capable of murder, of dismembering his wife in a fit of rage, was too much for many to process. Some clung to the belief that the preacher they had known couldn't possibly have done such a thing. He was always so kind, they'd say, their voices shaky with emotion. He wouldn't hurt a fly. Something's wrong here. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. The truth had been laid bare in the courtroom, and now, the walls of faith and trust were crumbling. The church, once a place of refuge, now stood empty, its pews gathering dust. The scandal had stained its reputation, and the congregation began to dwindle. There were those who couldn't bear to set foot in the church where Benjamin had preached, and there were others who, in the wake of the tragedy, simply couldn't find their way back to faith. The very place that had been built on a foundation of love and devotion had now become a symbol of betrayal. And then, there was Benjamin's father. The man who had played such a crucial role in his son's life, distant but present, revered by some, now found himself under a different kind of scrutiny. When news of the affair between him and Evelyn surfaced, he denied any wrongdoing. It was consensual, he insisted, his voice defensive. We were both adults. But no matter how he spun the truth, it didn't change the fact that his actions had shattered his son's world. It didn't change the fact that he had betrayed not just Benjamin's trust, but the trust of the entire family. His cold justification only added to the weight of the crime. Meanwhile, Benjamin's children, who had once been the picture of happiness, now faced an unrelenting storm of bullying and stigma. At school, they were the children of the murderer, the product of betrayal. Their classmates whispered behind their backs, pointed fingers when they walked down the hallway, and laughed at their pain. The weight of their family's secrets was a burden no child should bear. And yet, there were still questions that lingered, questions that would never be answered. Could Benjamin have avoided this path? Could he have sought help instead of bottling up his anger and humiliation? Had he reached out to anyone, confided in someone, would it have made a difference? Or was he doomed from the start, a man crushed under the weight of too many secrets, too many lies? What had driven Evelyn and his father to betray him so profoundly? Was it passion, something deeper than simple attraction? Or was it something darker, a need for power, control, or revenge? No one would ever know the full truth. But the damage had already been done. And the town, the church, and the family would never be the same. The scars of this crime ran deep, leaving wounds that could never truly heal. The preacher, once a symbol of faith, was now a cautionary tale, a man who had lost everything to a single act of rage and betrayal. As for his children, they were left to pick up the pieces of a broken life, a shattered legacy. The lessons they would carry with them were ones no child should ever have to learn. And as they walked away from the ruins of their family, the world would continue on, but the echoes of their father's crime would never fade. This story is a chilling reminder of how deep betrayal can go, and how it can destroy everything in its path. Benjamin Marshall's life, his family, and his community were all shattered by a single act of rage and the dark secrets that had festered for years. But what would you have done if you were in his place? Would you have sought help, or would you have let the anger consume you? We all like to think we'd make the right choices, but sometimes, when emotions run wild and trust is broken, the line between right and wrong becomes dangerously thin. So, what do you think? Was the preacher justified in his actions, or was there another way out? We want to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know. And don't forget to subscribe to Crimeberry Stories. We will bring you another gripping story. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more.